Hello and welcome to the Dumas Workshop. Today we're going to show you how to put a quality tissue covering job on one of our laser cut models. The model we're going to be working with is our beach stagger wing. Here's some of the materials that we're going to be using, pretty much standard modeling fare that you're going to be able to find in any home workshop. We've got some Elmer's glue, just regular white glue, glue stick, a straight edge, a single edge razor blade, small X-Acto knife comes in handy, a paintbrush, and a small set of scissors. Now let's get ready to get started on our project. Here we have our assembled non-covered pieces of the beach stagger wing. Bear in mind that all of this is assembled, already sanded, and ready for us to start putting the tissue to. Now we're going to start with the wing. Placing it on the tissue, we're going to trim around, leaving some excess. We'll use the straight edge razor blade for this. 1/4 to 1/2 inch of excess will make it easier for us to grab a hold of these. In this case, we're going to be putting the tissue shiny side down, or it will show as shiny side to the outside. Right there. Here we're going to be using the glue stick to apply some adhesive to the bottom of the wing frame. We're just going to lightly coat it here, and this is going to prepare it to be ready to accept the tissue. I'm just going to go around the perimeter. When we get ready to do this, what we're going to try to do is lay the tissue smoothly over it, and then we're going to be rolling the edges up. Now this is the bottom of the wing, so what's going to happen as a result is when the top portion goes on, we're going to have this nice smooth line where the two blend in together. Here's a good time to talk a little bit about the format of this video. I'm going to be doing some narration here as Tom performs the steps, and occasionally when things need a little bit more clarification, we'll be asking Tom a question, hopefully just like you would if you were seeing somebody do this at, let's say, a trade show as a demonstration. So Tom, here's the first question for you. I notice right now that you're putting the glue only on the outside edge. Why is that?
Applying the cement only to the outside frames allows the tissue to stretch over the entire area.
Here we're going to lay the tissue over the frame, and with smooth and even pressure, we're going to put the tissue over all the glued surface here on the wing frame. Now notice as we do this, we're just kind of taking the thumb and index finger and smoothing it around, making sure that we're keeping a tight, nicely pulled tissue over the frame. We aren't trying to get this tight like a drum head, but likewise we aren't looking to have any big sags in there either. Now that we have a portion of the wing covered, we're going to go ahead and kind of trim off some of this excess tissue. Now Tom, as you're trimming this, how much tissue are you trying to leave?
Leave at least 1/4 inch.
Okay, that'll give us something to work with and kind of fold around the sides. Now as we're trimming this, our next step is going to be coming up here real shortly. With the scissors, we're going to take and cut all these little tiny 1/8 inch snips, if you will. Now what that's going to enable us to do is when we get ready to fold this tissue around, we're going to have some place to go with that.
That's correct.
So as a result, whenever you're trying to do any kind of long curved surface, this is a technique that you want to perform. Now we're going to do the same thing to the other side. And we're going to have one more cut here that we're going to be making as we do this. And that is a snip right here at the dihedral points. Here we're getting ready to prepare our glue mixture. We're going to start off by squirting some thin white glue into this plastic cup, and we're going to thin it down to about a consistency of 50-50 with some water. This doesn't have to be an exact measurement, but what we're shooting for here is about the consistency of milk. If we have to fare one way to the other, we'd like it to be a little more glue and a little less water. We're just going to take our brush and mix this up real well, and we're ready to go. Now with our newly mixed, thinned down glue mixture, we're going to go over the entire edge of the frame here, just brushing on nice and evenly some of this glue. After we do this, we're going to be taking the tissue and kind of folding it over onto the edge. Now here brings about another question for us, Tom, as we're doing this. And here you can see, first of all, sorry to change tracks on you, but here you can see, first of all, that we're just kind of taking our finger and putting a nice hard edge all the way around that and smoothing it out as best we can. And now we're doing the same thing with all those little 1/8" snippets that we cut, making sure that we get glue around the frame. And here's where that's going to pay dividends for us, of course, because we're going to be able to take all of those little pieces as cuts and then fold them very easily around that wing tip. So Tom, back to the question. We've used glue stick for part of this, and we've used thin white glue for other. Why the thin white glue here?
I just found it easier to brush on the white glue versus the glue stick. Although if you do prefer using a glue stick, that's fine.
Okay, so basically you just really prefer using the white glue wherever the quarters get a little tighter and the radiuses and things like that.
That's right. Over the years, it's just easier to apply it with the brush.
It makes sense to me. So here we're just going to keep kind of following down the same path as we do this entire wing setup. And there really isn't a whole lot to say about this, so we'll just kind of let the video do its own work here. It's just really going to be more of the same as we nice and evenly brush this over and then get a nice hard edge over it. One thing I did notice here, Tom, as we keep going here, because you've got a nice even hand as you're brushing that glue on, is there any problems that occur from basically laying down too much glue?
No, not too much. The glue dries clear. If you do apply too much glue, you might stick the glue to the top surface, but most often that doesn't rarely happen.
So we're still just following the same course right here, and like I said, all those 1/8" snippets, you can see how smoothly they just folded around that wingtip. That's the real deal there. And we've kind of got our last little section here that we're putting on. Now the important thing that's going to happen next is as we fold this over and we have it all done, this is all wet glue, so at this point in time we're going to have to set it aside and let this dry. The next thing that we're going to be doing is taking this dried covered frame, and we're going to take our straight edge razor blade and carefully go around the perimeter trying to remove all this excess tissue. Now this brings about a few questions that would probably be helpful for us to know as we go here. So Tom, what is our goal here as far as how dry does this need to be when we get ready to go?
The tissue has to be totally dry, 100% dry. If it's still wet, the tissue will tear.
Okay, well that's fair enough and makes a lot of sense. Obviously, this has been sitting for a while since, we're seeing this by virtue of video. It seems to happen one right after another. How long did you let this sit before it was, in your opinion, really dry?
The wing frame sat for at least an hour.
Fair enough. Now, as we go through this, we're taking, like I said, that straight edge razor blade, and we're kind of working around the perimeter. Now, one of the things that I notice here on occasion, Tom, is we get like a little tiny piece of balsa that maybe comes off and gets stuck on there. How about that? Does that present an issue for us?
No, that's just a slip of the knife blade.
So those will be things that will never really show in the finished product. So that's good news, because I know a lot of these kind of things really kind of panic people as they're doing this. But I think the important thing is here that this is pretty forgivable, and nothing that can't really, short of taking a huge gouge out of it, is really no big deal, right?
Right.
Okay, fantastic. I can see the virtue here of having a really sharp razor blade, and I imagine this is one of those things where if the blade gets the least bit dull on you, you probably want to just go ahead and exchange it. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, it has to be extremely sharp. Any dull blade will just rip the tissue. It won't give a nice clean cut.
Well, we're going to keep going here, and we are almost finished as we go to the tip, and then we will be moving on to covering our next wing section. Now we're going to move on to the covering of the top of the wing. I'm going to start off by doing pretty much the same thing that we did for the bottom, only this time we're going to leave the center section open. So we're going to be cutting tissue well in excess of what we need here, about a ½ inch extra around. And notice that we just cut enough to cover one of the outer panels. Using our glue stick, we're going to be going once again just around the outer edges and getting that ready to lay down. And with pretty much the same technique as we used earlier, we're going to place that tissue over it, and with our thumb and forefinger, we're going to put that nice even pressure right around the entire surface. This is going to be remarkably like what we did earlier, with just a very few minor exceptions. Now, with our scissors, and you could use a razor blade for this part as well, but here we're going to be using the scissors. We're going to be very careful as we make this cut, because we are trying to get about a 1/16 of an inch all the way around this. So here's where some extra time will really do you well to pay attention to some of these details, and just hold that as tight as a tolerance as you possibly can. Now we're going to do the same thing to the other side. And as I said, really can't be too careful at this point, because this will really pay dividends a little later on. So if you take your time and really try to hold it at about a 1/16, this will really help you as we work to finish off this wing. Now using very much the same technique as we did earlier, although it's harder to see because we're working with a much less amount of material than we had before. We're taking all those little snippets that we did, and those are still approximately about an 1/8 inch apart. You can kind of remember these from when we folded them over when we were working on the bottom of the wing earlier. We're going to be doing the same thing again. So here we have our thinned white glue mixture. And most likely you're going to have to remix that mixture, because probably what happened before is that has hardened out on you since the previous time. So I guess that brings about the point of don't mix up really too much material, because you don't want to be wasting a lot. But you can see we're doing exactly the same thing. And you can see how important that 1/16 of an inch really was, because what that enabled us to do is we're just brushing down on the edge here, and then we are folding that over. But when we were working the bottom, we were able to fold it over the entire leading and trailing edge. But here, we don't want to wrap it around. We want it to really terminate on the leading and trailing edge. So we're still pretty much following the same technique that we used on the bottom, using our glue mixture, spreading it nice and evenly around, not being too heavy-handed, just trying to get it on the part that we want to fold over, and then smoothing it around and making it the nicest, cleanest line that we possibly can. You can see as we're going here, our wing's really starting to take shape. You can see the occasional slight puckering here and there, not a tightness, more of a sag. You don't want it too tight. You want to have like these little sags here and there, because when we shrink it, then it's not going to twist and warp anything. But yet again, it's not real baggy either. Now, of course, you notice that we've left that opening for the dihedral. Here is where we're going to be trimming out the final section that we just kind of overhung a little bit when we were putting our tissue on. So this area is just going to kind of peel out of there, and that's going to leave us open for where the dihedral will be added. And of course that section will be covered at a later point in time. Now we're getting ready to cover the center section, and to do that we're going to first measure the distance from rib to rib, and this is going to include the thickness of both those root ribs. Now, after we have that dimension, we're going to transfer it over to the tissue paper, and we're going to cut it out using a straight edge. Very important to try to keep this as straight as possible, and either a razor blade or an X-Acto knife blade. Either one will do really well. The important thing here is keeping this measurement as close as possible. Once again, will really pay off for us in the long run. Now, like pretty much all of the wing covering that we have done to this point, we're going to follow pretty much the same technique. Here we're going to take our 50-50 solution, always making sure that this is nice and fresh and ready to go, and brush it along the entire surface of what we are getting ready to cover. This area is going to be the leading and trailing edge, and the root ribs is what we're going to be gluing. Now, taking our tissue, we're going to go ahead and cover that section and just kind of smooth it down with our fingers as we've done in the past, giving that nice hard edge that we like to have. Obviously, we've had to let this dry, as we have in the past, in order for the razor blade to cut through that and not pull it off. Taking our thin white glue, we're going to go along that edge, which is approximately a 1/16, much like the rest of the top of the wing, in order to have that nice, tight, just folding over the leading edge and folding over the trailing edge section that we're looking for. And as we smooth that out, we'll let it dry, and we have one completed wing ready to go. Now we're going to move on to the stabilizer. The stabilizer is covered almost exactly the same way as the wing. We're going to start off by laying our build-up stabilizer onto the tissue. And then we're going to kind of do this nice big cut around there, once again leaving plenty of excess material for us to grab a hold of as we work this. Now, using our glue stick, we're going to work around the outside edges of the stabilizer, making sure that we have everything coated. It's a good time to bring about a point of how much pressure to apply. We're all used to working with these glue sticks on nice flat surfaces that really let you bear down and smash it around. As all of you know who have built one of these airplanes, that isn't the case here. The balsa is light and very easy to break, so you just want to be nice and light-handed with it. Make sure that you're getting glue applied, but make sure also that the area that you're gluing is supported. Here we're going to take it and lay it right on top of the tissue, smashing it down and giving a nice contact on there. And here we're going to once again do the same thing with our thumb and forefinger. We're going to just kind of work it around there and make sure that it is secured to the surface. Here we're taking our scissors and we're going to kind of cut around here. And this is more of a broad cut. We don't have to keep to that same tight 1/16 that we did earlier when we were covering the top of the wing. And like on the wing earlier, we're going to take those nice little 1/8" snippets and we're going to work around the perimeter here. And this is going to be the area that we're going to be able to fold over. Now this brings about a question for me that I've noticed that Tom, you move pretty easily in and out of razor blade to scissors and back and forth. What makes you determine which one you're going to use for a particular time?
It doesn't really matter. I like to use scissors more. I get a better control with scissors than a razor blade, but personal preference is up to you.
Okay, and like I say, right here we're getting ready to trim around the stabilizer. Now here we're making some fairly unique cuts. Now you've kind of cut a section out of there in a triangular shape, and now wherever that tissue has to fold over, I see that we're making little snippet cuts, which are going to enable us to be able to fold that over when the time comes. Now we're taking our thinned white glue again, and we're probably pretty much going to have to constantly be making up a batch of this, because you want it to be as fresh as possible whenever you're doing any of these steps. So here we've applied it in the corner, and now we're going to do our fold over. You see, we're just folding it over to the edge itself. We aren't folding it over onto the bottom side. So we've got a pretty healthy amount that's going to be standing up on this throughout. We're going to follow this exact same sequence throughout the entire stabilizer here, where we're going to be brushing on some glue, doing a small section, and then folding the pieces up. And once again, letting them dry like we did previously on the wing. Here we go, all those little snippet sections, there they get folded up. So let's go ahead as we finish off the stabilizer here from a gluing standpoint. Now as we finish this up, of course, as we know from earlier, the next portion of this is going to be to let this to dry. And as in earlier times, we found out from Tom that this was going to take about an hour to set aside and dry. So there is, of course, a lot of time lapse in here. But as we finish this up, we have totally now covered one side and pretty much got it all glued up here. And as we did earlier, after it has dried, we take a nice sharp razor blade, and don't be afraid to change those razor blades out often. It just makes your life so much easier to have the sharpest possible razor blade. And we're going to go around the perimeter. What we saw Tom do there was just kind of flick the paper back a little bit to make sure that it isn't stuck in any way to the other side. It makes it a lot easier to trim off. The drier the better, the sharper the better. It's just all going to make so much sense as you start working this through. And you can see how easily it's releasing from the covering here. And as on the wing, as the tissue is down there, we're looking for a nice covering, but not pulled tight like a drum, because once again, this will be shrunk. Here we go, and we're going to be doing the other side of the stabilizer now. And this is going to be an exact technique as to what we did on the other side. Now let's just sit back, watch this. It's a great opportunity to make some comparisons to what we did on the other side and see how easy this truly is. Now we're going to move on to the rudder. It's going to be covered exactly the same way as we did the stabilizer. Here we've cut out our rough size tissue, and we're going to be applying the glue stick, again being very careful not to press too hard and force the frame anywhere that we don't want it to go. Hear any unnecessary cracking sounds. Here we're going to lay the tissue in place and gently pull it tight and smooth out over the edges here with our fingers. Be careful not to tear the tissue at this point. Here we're trying to get right down into the crease a little bit where that flare is at the bottom of the rudder, which is a fairly unique feature on the beach stagger wing, and we'll be covering that here in a moment. Taking our scissors, we're going to cut our trim basically about 1/4 of an inch away, as we have in so many of the models. And since the rudder is almost entirely a curved surface, we're going to be taking these little snippets virtually all the way around it. Now, as we get down here to the lower part, we're going to trim a little closer and take out some of the excess material. Now, using another fresh batch of our thinned down white glue, we're going to go ahead and go around the perimeter here, as we have on the stabilizer and on the wing. A lot of the technique is so similar throughout the entire construction. It's just getting familiar and confident with the whole process. Now we're going to fold up our little snip sections here and give us our nice area that we need to set up to be trimmed around. Now we get to that flared portion, and this does require a little bit of attention. Notice how we're trimming a little more closely to this to try to get it to cover the size, and we're taking some snippets out of this as well. What we're going to find is when we cover this with the glue down here in this section, that we're going to soften up the tissue to the point that it will conform to some of these compound curves on this section. You'll see as we put this down that the tissue starts to wet out very nicely and really allows it to take form. Now, as with before, after we've given it sufficient time to dry, approximately an hour, we're able to take and cut around the perimeter here. Being careful not to cut into the balsa. Now as we get down to the flare, we're going to find that we're going to cut right down the center line, which we can just kind of pull this area away now. And when we get to the point that we cover the other side of the rudder, we'll have a nice match up as to where we can head with that. Little scissors here to cut off that finished part. And here we take our little snips, which we can fold in later. Now let's go to the other side, and we're going to pretty much follow it exactly the same way. here we have our completed rudder. Now it's onto the fuselage. Taking a sheet of tissue, we're going to cut, once again, a larger segment than what we require. And we're going to kind of talk about this a little bit as we go, because there will be a lot of fill-in time as we're working this around. The fuselage is probably the trickier part for people to kind of envision, and that's where this video is really going to be so helpful, because you're really going to see very close how this is done, because you can almost picture how a rudder would be covered, how a stabilizer would be covered, even how a wing would be covered, but it does get a little trickier when you look at the more complex shape of a fuselage. As we go here, we are taking the extreme outside stringers or frame, and we are putting down our 50-50 solution of white glue. Once again, we don't want the entire surface covered, because when we get ready to shrink, it'd be impossible for the tissue to do so if it was totally glued to the entire framework. It's going to take a little bit of time here as we work around this area with the white glue. Now we're going to take our tissue and we're going to lay it gently over our glued surfaces here, over the side that we have just done, and we're going to kind of smooth it out. And you'll see the glued sections appear as we press down on it, because it'll show as a wet spot there on the tissue as we go. Just kind of taking our time to smooth out any wrinkles that might be there, because once again, doesn't have to be tight, but we do want it to be not all dented in and wrinkled either. Here we're taking some stress relief cuts, and this will enable the tissue to fold over areas in a similar way to the little cuts that we made in the wings and on the rudder and stabilizer earlier, but these are going to be more definite, and you can just kind of see it all take shape now as we make those cuts and then fold them over. We'll point out at this time that we are doing the cowl separately, and that's why it has not been glued all the way out. You see here we're laying down just a little bit more glue, and then this section is going to fold up over the top of the fuselage here. Now, after giving ample time to dry, we're going to take our nice sharp razor blade and we're going to start working this around. Notice how we kind of keep some tension as we work that knife around. You can also see as Tom cuts towards his hand with the razor blade why we picked an airplane with red tissue. The tension on the tissue just makes it easier to cut away from the fuselage. Here we're doing some final trimming up. And you can really start to see this take the shape. And this is so hard for people to envision. It usually is one of the bigger questions that we get. But once you see it, it becomes so clear. Here, we're cutting off perfectly around this frame, because as we mentioned earlier, we're going to be covering the cowl area separately. So we're just cutting right around that frame and relieving this piece of material from it. This will be much easier to cover separately. few more final trims here. The next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be showing you covering the top of the fuselage. Do realize that there's another side to cover, which is going to be done exactly the same way. Here we are on the top. Now to the top of the fuselage. We're going to pretty much follow the same technique as we did when we were covering the sides. We have cut our oversized piece of tissue, and we're going to take our mixture of thinned down, approximately 50% white glue, and once again we're going to brush it on to the outermost frames, stringers. Now here's something to bear in mind when we're doing this. It would be to our advantage to be very, very light-handed with the glue at this point in time. As we apply the tissue at a later point on top of this, if we start smashing glue down onto the other surface, it will be harder to trim. And likewise, we don't want any big glue blobs running down the section that we have just so nicely covered. So we'll just want to be a little more light-handed with it as we go on to this. Now as we put the tissue onto our glued frame, we're of course being careful and smoothing it out and not having any wrinkles as we have in the past. Here after we have allowed it to dry for our approximate 1 hour, we're going to go ahead and take our knife, our razor blade, and we're going to be working around the perimeter once again and trying to cut it as close, because this is going to be a seam that we're going to have here. So we're going to cut it nice and clean and as close as we can to the framework. The sharper the razor blade, the better off we will be at this point. It's always important to bear in mind that this really isn't a race, and it's all about how nice of a job that we do. So just take your time at any of these steps and make it as clean as you possibly can. Once again, notice how Tom holds a little bit of tension on that tissue as he's trying to pull away. You know, it's kind of like when you're wrapping a gift. It's always easier when you have some tension here and you're trying to work the scissors down it. Very much the same thing here applies when you're working with this tissue. We've got that trim nice and close now, and here we're going to do just some final trimming again. And now it's on to the bottom. Here we are taking our oversized piece of tissue. We're going to pretty much do the same thing that we have done in the past. We're going to cut out a piece well beyond the size that we need, so we have something to work with here. That's the nice part about our kits. We're pretty generous with the amount of materials that you get in there, so you'll have plenty of material to be able to work with. Now taking our thinned white glue, we're going to go once again over the outermost stringers and frames and get that prepared to be glued down. Now Tom, here's where I've got a question for you, because I have heard people talking about covering tissue that is dampened or wet when they use it. I noticed you've done everything dry. Why is that?
Domestic tissue will tear when it's wet, so it's best to apply it dry and then spray it to shrink it later.
Fair enough. Now that we've got that all glued up, we're going to take our piece of tissue and once again gently smooth it over the frame. Here we're taking some stress relief cuts, and what this is going to enable us to do is to more easily follow that concave shape that we're trying to attach to. When Tom was doing this, he wasn't putting it down too hard. By doing these little stress release cuts, it'll take any of the wrinkles out of there as we completely smooth this down. Now we're going to do a similar thing with the front bottom here. only this time we're going to be a little more careful in our sizing of this. So it's going to be much easier to kind of do a more of a measured cut, if you will, so we don't have so much excess material. Now that we've got that sized up about where we want it to be, we're going to take our glue, once again brushing it on the outer stringers and frame. We'll take our tissue and lay it over that surface. And much with like when we did the top, we want to be careful not to put too much glue down, because it does make it harder when we get ready to trim later. And when you get it to this point in the game, you really don't want to have any more glue than necessary on some of these surfaces. Here we've given it time to dry, and now we're going to take our cuts to do our final trim and remove our excess tissue. Here we're going to take some of our final trims now. And you can really see at this point that the entire presence of the fuselage is really present. You can still see, as we talked about earlier, how you can spot that the tissue isn't really tight, but then again, it's not baggy loose either. We only have one part left to go, and that's going to be the cowling, which we did mention that we were going to do separately. So after we get this final piece trimmed off, let's move on to that. The cowling here is basically round, so it made it real easy to do as its own piece. We're going to be a little more careful as we do this, and we're going to cut a consistent size piece, and we're going to use the straight edge. Now, Tom, when you cut that, about how much overhang were you looking for when you did that?
About a ½ inch.
Okay, so we've got about a ½ inch from where we have that frame that we're butting it up to where we stick out over the front?
That's right.
Okay. Here, once again, taking our thin white glue, we're going to go ahead and glue our outer edges. And this will take just a little bit of time, but the same principle that we've been following throughout here is how we're going to accomplish this. Now we're going to take our band that we have cut, and we're going to pretty much just walk it right around this cowling section. Just smoothing it out as we go. Plenty of extra material here. And the nice part is any of those seams, because we've seen it so many times here before, that appear to be a wet, dark band, are going to dry up so nicely by virtue of the glue that we're using. Now we're going to finish gluing this last remaining section, and then we can fold the tissue over the rest of it. Take out our razor blade and make our trim here after, of course, drying. And this will be our final section up until the time that we are now fully covered. Now that we have that last piece trimmed off, in order to fold our tissue around this circle, we're going to make those same cuts that we have done so many times in the past. But first of all, we have to start off by trimming this a little bit closer. We're trying to get this to the point that it'll be about a 3/16 of an inch band that'll be remaining. And now we will take our series of approximately 1/8 inch cuts and work all the way around here. And we're now ready for our last little bit of gluing. We're going to glue that tissue. Just making sure we have enough glue on it to allow it to stick. And now we're going to start folding those little pieces over. And there we go, one finished fuselage. Now that we have all of these pieces covered, it's time to shrink it. Now here we have Tom spraying the fuselage with basically what is just a bottle of water. Now Tom, I've heard some people use alcohol in addition to the water. Why would that be?
Alcohol dries faster, and it doesn't shrink as much as water will.
Okay, so in our instances here, we're using just water, and that seems to work just fine for you.
That's perfect.
Excellent. Now, how wet are you getting these items?
Just damp, not soggy wet.
Okay, and there we have our totally ready to go, dried out items that have now been shrunk, and I can see how tight they are compared to before. And now those parts, since they are all dry, are ready to be doped. And here we're using some Pactra clear dope with a 1/2 inch brush, which Tom feels works pretty well for what he's doing. And we are generously, but not too heavy-handedly, putting the dope onto the wing surface. Now this is the only surface that we're going to show you putting the dope on, because it all pretty much goes the same way. The thing to keep in mind about this is one coat will give you a nice glossy finish for a lightweight airplane. 2 coats will make it even a bit glossier, but will make it heavier. So certainly don't exceed 2 coats on what it is that on whatever project it is that you're working on. Nice even strokes, the same way that you would really try to apply any kind of finish, will give you an excellent result here with the dope. As we finish these off, we're going to set them aside to let them dry. And then we've got a few other tricks that we can show you here along the way. One of the things that can really set a model apart is having multiple colors of tissue on it. And that's what we're going to show you how to accomplish here. Some of our most staggering models are some of them that have 2 and 3 tissue coverings on them in various finishes. It really sets things apart nicely. Now what Tom is doing here is he is cutting a scallop pattern that he's going to be putting on the wing of the stagger wing. Don't let this level of ability fool you. He has transferred this on with pencil here, so he doesn't cut these little perfect arcs by hand. Once we have this cut out, we're going to lay it onto the wing and get it lined up about where we want it. Now this is a little bit different of a situation here because it's not going to be glued down, it's not going to be doped down. What we're doing here is we are using dope thinner. What that does is it will penetrate through the material, through the covering, and it will soften up the dope from below. And it will basically adhere by making the two almost one in a way. Be sure when you are doing this step that we have the glossy side of the tissue down. That seems to really work best for us. Now what we've done here is we've got this all pretty much saturated with the dope thinner, and we're going to allow that to dry. Now very much like what we did when we were trying to trim the wing closely, we're going to be very careful and leave about that 1/16 of an inch because that's just going to fold over the leading edge. We don't want it to wrap clear around to the bottom. So we're going to spend our extra time here giving a nice close trim. Now we're going to smooth that down, and you can see it's just really right there over the leading edge and gives a very, very nice effect. Now what will happen in some instances is little corners or little points might pop up. That is so easily handled, but rather than going over it with more thinner, the easy thing to do here is to take some of your 50-50 white glue water solution and to just put a little bit of glue on them and adhere those down because they're going to dry nice and clear for you. And it'll really make them stick down far better than dope ever will. So as we hit all those points, we just kind of run over them with your finger there just to make sure that they're down. And anything that we do here where we add glue, we're going to let it dry before we do any other step. Now that that is done, we're going to once again take our Aerogloss dope and we're going to go over the surface that we just added. You don't have to be panic-stricken about only staying to that surface. If you run over onto some of the red, which you can see that we're doing here, it's just going to dry as one color, or not really one color, but as one finish anyway. It's not going to say, oh my, look how much glossier that portion of the wing is than the other portion. It'll all have the same appearance when it's done. And there we have it, a finished wing with a nice special effect on it. And there we have our finished plane. Well, we certainly hope that you've enjoyed the video and that you're a little more comfortable and confident when you move on to finishing your airplane models.